let's not kid ourselves, although it feels good to do so. We're sitting here with, you know, the inventor of Nightline, with the steward of the #1 evening news broadcast, with the CEO of NPR. There are a lot of examples of journalism that are driven by pure circulation considerations that clearly could be called pandering. And I think that one of the values of a news literacy course is that it enables the consumers to make distinctions and figure out, in addition to the sourcing, why did they put this on, or what makes it news in the eyes of the people who chose to put it on. To that point, or at least related to that point, starting with Ted and then Alex, it struck me listening this morning, I wondered to what extent you feel that we as news providers live up to the standards that Howie is now teaching his students about. I think we sometimes honor these principles in the breach.
I think you're right. I think there's a lot of that going around, but let me say something that I hope will be even more provocative. Somehow, when we add the term democratization to a concept, we as Americans automatically respond by saying, democracy, democratization, has to be good. I don't think so. I don't think the democratization of news gathering is necessarily, in and of itself, a good thing. The fact that on the internet we may have 10 million people blogging and giving us information without our being able to determine who the source is, what the motives of that particular person may be, I think is horrifying. The one thing you had when you had us on the air, the one thing we have when we tune in 60 Minutes every week, is that you've got half a dozen people on 60 Minutes who've been there since before the flood. You know, they're 90 years old, for God's sake, and still going strong. But at least we know where they came from. We know something about them. We know something about the process that takes place at a CBS and at a 60 Minutes. There are producers, there are executives, there are managers, there are people who make sure that certain standards are met. If we start to fail on keeping our own standards, then we have to expect that people are going to dump us by the millions and start pursuing their own course. But I'm simply saying, I think that kind of democratization is a disaster.
So Ted, I want to come back to the notion of whether news organizations live up to the standards we talked about. But actually, your comment there, it is provocative, and it just, let me be devil's advocate for a second. Listening to all this talk about news literacy, what if I were to say, you know, it's not news literacy, it's news orthodoxy. And all we're really doing by talking about it, these are traditional media types trying to hold back the inevitable tide of democratization, of a new kind of news where citizens get to have their own voice and where the community will root out inaccuracy, will elevate the best stories in a very democratic way, and that your model is dead, it's not coming back. Don't try to preserve it in aspect with these rules by telling me what's good and what isn't.
I'd say you're probably going to get your wish. And you'll be sorry.
No. Ted is now on the 16th hole after that fantastic birdie on 15. And,
I must confess, I turned on the television this morning at about 6:45, and I flipped from channel to channel to channel. And you know what I saw? Helicopter shots of Bernie Madoff's car as he made his way from his luxurious penthouse suite to the arms of justice. Did I learn anything about Bernie Madoff during that trip? Not on any one of the channels that I saw. That, you know, so much of what is on television today, and I must confess, I focus more on cable in this instance than I do on traditional media. Cable news seems to be in a desperate rush to be first with the obvious. There is no context. Immediacy takes precedence over context. And we're going to get more and more and more of that, Andrew. And yes, I'll still be standing on the bow of that sinking ship yelling, "I told you," but it's sinking.
Well, that's a perfect segue, or as my daughter once said, segue, to you, Alex, to ask then about whether news providers themselves should focus more on the very things we talked about in the session this morning. I'm not just saying this to be nice. You were a terrific producer before you became an executive. You went back to producing. You have very high editorial standards. To what extent do you think we're really living up to what we heard about this morning in our editing process?
Well, I mean, I feel like Pollyanna up here. I think we live up to it. I mean, the newsrooms that I've worked in, there is unbelievable editorial debate all day. The job I just came out of nightly, when I was running nightly news, was exhausting. All we did was fight about editorial all day. I think that the traditional media, and again, to Ted's point, we can't control it and we are losing share, but I think the traditional media does a pretty good job. I mean, I can only speak for where I've worked, which is NBC and CBS News. There's a lot of frivolous stuff. I completely agree with you, but I actually think there are a lot of people doing very serious, important work who take it very seriously. We have debates about ethics all day, about it's Mexico and what stories are we ignoring, and so I think we hold up to what the audience expects of us. Now, the fact that the audience is still going away, that's a different subject.
Why do we say? Well, everybody keeps saying the audience is going away. The business model is incredibly screwed up, but I don't buy that the audience for serious journalism is going away. I mean, the New York Times website gets I think the February numbers are 21 million uniques a month. NPR programming gets 25 million listeners a week. I realize that is a different conversation than the business model and how we're going to pay for it. But I don't see that the audience is going away. I really take exception to that. I think people do understand there is, not everybody, but there is a strata of the population, a large one, that numbers in the tens of millions who get it.
Well, but just to Ted's point, the audience has gone to different places. I mean,
nightly
news
that's different.
Right.
Yeah.
But I mean, to your point, I agree. I actually think the same percentage, I don't know, and this is in a small unscientific study, probably the percentage of people interested in news today is the same as it was before. I agree with you. I think there is huge hunger for news. What I do think is broken is the model of how we...
The business model.
The business model.
No, so, yeah, Neil, weigh in
Well,
on
I was
this.
gonna say, I think there's also some work to be done on the product to some degree. And I'm not saying in traditional media in terms of what's a half-hour newscast or what's a radio show or what's a, but I think there is an appetite out there. The AP did some really great research, ethnographic research on young readers that's available on the web. It's a great read, and it clearly shows that younger people are in fact interested in depth in knowing about more than just the facts and what happened in the last few minutes, in the Bernie Madoff, helicopter scene. There is an interest in depth, but I think part of it is how do we engage those people in ways that pull them in. And I think there is some other issues that touch on your question, Andrew, about some of the things that were taught in news literacy. And I kept listening to the discussion of deconstructing news stories. And I'm not saying that this needs to be done a lot with some of the larger, more established news organizations, but a lot of news that's out there, I keep wondering, well, why do we have to deconstruct it? Why didn't the reporter explain more about the sourcing and why do we have to have the reader make a decision, well, what do I think might be the motivation of that source for saying that? Why can't we have more of that built into the coverage and the way in which we produce it? I think one of the things that some of the better, more successful bloggers have done is that very thing. They'll say, this person said this, I haven't been able to verify it, and I think the reason he or she may be saying this is probably because they want to spin the story this way. They put that in, I mean, not every blogger, because a lot of them are horrible, the millions of them are, but there's some good ones out there, and they tell the story in a different way. And I think that's the kind of thing we need to be thinking about, and that we can learn from some of the stuff that was shown in the news literacy thing this morning about, let's stop forcing people to deconstruct our stories, give them more of that up front.